Dor Abrahamson, thank you for accepting my invitation to be on my podcast today. And
Thanks, Stephen. Great being here.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry to cut you off there, but I always start this first question. I'm in kind of podcast mode at the moment. And my first question I always ask my guests is, for those who are listening today, so who don't know anything about you, maybe you can give a brief synopsis. Tell us a little bit about yourself for those who are listening.
Okay, well, oddly, I began my studies as a cellist who was also taking some mathematics courses. I couldn't decide if I wanted to be a mathematician, a cellist, or what. Eventually, having got a diploma in cello, I went on to study cognitive psychology. And it was during that time I realized that what most interests me is how children develop understandings of mathematical concepts. So I was eager to study the cognitive development of mathematical concepts. And moreover, I had always been building gadgets for kids to learn math. And so that somehow became integrated into my work. I was told that what I do is called design-based research. And so when I wanted to do a PhD, I looked for places where I could do design-based research of the cognitive development of mathematical concepts. And I found that at Northwestern University. So that's where I got my doctoral degree. And it's really there where I took this idea of design-based research to a new level, where I could conduct qualitative analyses of how children learn when they engage with activities that I create, and writing that up, which led to the degree. But at the same time, I also got increasingly interested in theory. And what design-based research does, it's really a form of educational research that is, how shall I say, it's vested in cycles of ideating solutions to educational problems. You ideate, you build, you engineer, you take it out to the field, you implement, you gather data, you analyze the data very closely to try to understand how valid were those theories you began from, and perhaps they need to be substituted or tweaked, corroborated or elaborated or interrogated. And so I find that my practice as a design-based researcher enables me to do the two things I enjoy most, which is still creating gadgets, but that became also digital, not just mechanical, creating all kinds of educational resources, technological resources for learning mathematics, but at the same time developing theoretical models of what it means to know, what it means to teach, what it means to learn, which of course is what brought me eventually to the shores of embodiment, which I gather we'll be talking about today. So thanks for having me here.
Yeah, thanks for accepting my invitation. I'm really excited because I've got so many questions I want to ask you. So let's go with an obvious one, and then we'll move to some questions about embodiment. But if anyone was to ask you what learning is, what would you say to them in response?
Well, I've become increasingly a staunch enactivist. And so I would say that I would always go back to evolution. I might say, and this will be tricky to do in audio only without video, so I'll just encourage people at home to invoke the famous picture of by Michelangelo, which usually if you're at the Vatican, you have to look way up to see. It's the creation of man. I guess these days we'll say creation of humans, anatomy notwithstanding in that picture. However, in that picture, you see on one side, on the left, you see Adam, who's just been created. And on the right, you see God, who's handing over sort of the spark of life. And you see their hands are very close one to the other. The fingers are almost touching, but they're not. Now, this picture I've been using for decades now in my presentations to open up the subject of what it means to learn, what it means to be an individual who finds themselves by being born into some context, into some cultural place where they bring to bear their evolutionary capacity, this epigenetic evolutionary capacity that's been honed through millions of years and of our species becoming who and what we are. these are capacities to engage in the natural and cultural ecology in ways that are wonderfully adaptive. Now, on the other hand, we have God or teacher or what I call the cultural forms that the child needs to adopt, needs to appropriate if they are going to successfully participate in the what we call the social enactment of cultural practices. If they are going to, well, do well in our world as they find it, particular languages, particular thoughts, particular ideas, particular artifacts they need to use, including things like, well, fractions and algebra and geometry and calculus. So for me, learning is precisely that dialectic between the child, or as Art Glenberg might call it, the biological cognitive systems on the one hand, and yet on the other hand, the cultural forms that the child needs to appropriate. So learning is always teaching in some sense, in that the child already finds themselves in a certain figured world that is rife with all these artifacts and epistemic forms. So for me, learning is the dialectic between the individual and the culture, the milieu they find themselves in, whereby they need to negotiate between their evolutionary capacities and all of these wondrous tools, artifacts that we have as a civilization developed over the millennia. So I always look to see this negotiation between, on the one hand, on the left, naked Adam with the biological cognitive systems, and on the right, culture, teachers, mentors, family, what have you, with the various cultural forms that we have created to extend and to enhance these naked capacities. So that's learning for me.
Yeah, sure. And so, enactivism, how would you describe that for those who are listening? So what is there will be listeners who will have heard of different learning theories like constructivism, but you mentioned enactivism, and I guess the question would be, well, what is, say, enactivism, say, versus constructivism, say, versus other learning theories?
Yeah, well, all the isms and ologies,
yes.
Right? And sometimes they are closer to each other than it's one of these kind of hair-splitting things at times, where from the outside people say, oh yes, this new movement in the cognitive sciences called embodiment, and yet when you look from the inside, you see many more differences, and sometimes it almost seems like one of those Monty Python scenes where we are fighting over what others cannot see as a difference at all. And so enactivism is the doctrine developed by Francisco Varela and his associates, whereby the basic notion is that all cognitive activity, if you will, thinking, communicating, decide, everything your mind is doing is always necessarily, by definition, sensory motor activity. So it is not the case. What is being rejected here by virtue of adopting these doctrines, what's being rejected is a metaphor that has been rife in the 20th century, whereby the brain is likened to a computer that takes in information and then somehow, takes in information through the various sensory modalities. This word modality will be important in the conversation. So we're bringing in sound and sight and taste and what have you, and then as though it comes into the brain and it changes into computational like propositions and symbols and abstract stuff that is then somehow processed. You hear these statements about humans processing information, etc., until various inferences are arrived at that then govern or inform certain actions that are back in the world. So there's this general idea, which it's shockingly popular, that the brain is this like a CPU. It behaves without access anymore to the senses or to the motor system. It's not sensory and it's not motor, as though it's amodal, a in the sense of not, amodal, So enactivism, excuse the double negative, it rejects the amodal, meaning all thinking is necessarily modal. It is the very same kind of cerebral neural capacity that we evolved as a species in our natural and cultural ecology. These very same capacities are what bear or constitute what we call thinking. All thinking is necessarily activating the senses and the motor, the premotor cortex, the motor cortex. They are all involved, and not just as kind of tag-alongs. That is the nature of thinking. All thinking is necessarily situated in the world as we perceive it. It is building and using, appropriating and enacting these very same modalities as we use when we seem to be doing stuff in the would-be outward world. So enactivism, it has two principles. And the first one is rather simple or rather direct. I think the second one is more difficult to explain. The first one, they state, all perception is for action, meaning whenever you perceive, when you just look at your cup of coffee now, you might say to yourself, oh, that's just an image. That has nothing to do with doing. I'm just looking at it. But an activist will reject that notion, saying, no. Whenever you look at your cup of coffee, you're also depending on the context of what you wish to do or what you're thinking about. But you may look at the cup of coffee and already your premotor motor cortex are activated in sense of grasping so the all perception is for prospective action, and this goes back millions and millions of years when we were, one cells, two cells, etc. When we were in this mucus mush of just moving about, first we had a motor capacity, but then it seemed like it really might help us as organisms if we were somehow this motor capacity was somehow informed by knowing what's around us. Are we moving perhaps towards food? That would be really useful to know where the food is. Or are we moving towards someone who will gobble us up? That is also useful to know. And so the senses, sensory organs as we know them, developed to inform our motor capacity. So evolutionarily and neurally, and we believe phenomenologically too, the senses are always inherently informing motor capacity. So when I perceive something, when I look towards something or listen or hold something, neurally I'm already doing so with a certain prospective horizon of actions in mind. So all of that is principle number one, that perception is always perception for action. And even just that in and of itself has huge implications for the cognitive sciences and for education in terms of the kinds of resource we want to make available. But then you may ask, well, okay, so yeah, we can grasp a cup of coffee. What about algebra? what about any learning? What is the learning process? So here we go into principle number 2. I'll state it and see if I can remember it verbatim, but then I'll unpack it. They will say that cognitive structures, or what we might call that which concepts maybe lie upon or stand upon. Cognitive structures emerge when a certain sensory motor activity proves effective for the task you're trying to accomplish. So that as you are exploring, well, let's go back to the cup of coffee. You're a baby and you're trying to grasp a cup. Because the baby, let's just say it's an empty plastic cup. You're trying to grasp this cup, and you fumble with your fingers and your thumb, and it keeps falling, and you keep trying. You're a baby, and until at some point, somehow that which you do with your hand engulfs the cup, and you literally find yourself, you're able to draw towards you. So you have been engaging in sensory motor exploration, haptic proprioceptive, kinesthetic, somatic, of trying to bring this object towards you. At a certain point, some certain combination of what you sense with your fingers and the way you curl them, the sensory motor pattern, turned out to be task effective. Well, through Hebbian learning, your new cognitive structures will emerge in your head, which subsequently or prospectively will enable your actions, such as, I want to grasp the cup of coffee. They will enable that action to be perceptually guided. Okay? Perception in and of itself is like a pan-domain cognitive inclination, cognitive capacity to attend to the world in ways that enable you to actuate your intentionality. And it is through these sensory motor explorations that you create new cognitive structures that henceforth will enable your actions to be perceptually guided. So that is a very long-winded principle number 2. But that is really, if one understands that, I believe, then it's like your codex for everything you might want to do as an educational designer and ultimately as an educator. You need to understand that all reasoning, lower order, higher order, what have you, if you're thinking about history or geography or law, or in my case, mathematics, it is always that you are attending to certain objects that you wish to act upon, even if these are imaginary objects. It doesn't really matter whether something is, the word matter here is loaded, it doesn't really matter whether something is matter or material or immaterial. If I'm thinking now of a pink unicorn, it is my imaginary percept. It's in front of me, just as my laptop is right here in front of me. And if I want people to learn a concept, I need to figure out, and this may be taking us to the next question about design. If I want children to learn a mathematical concept, I need to figure out how to, my colleague Dave Pratt calls that to phenomenalize, meaning to take the concept. Let's take a very simple concept like addition, which I think we're all pretty comfortable with, like even just single-digit addition, like 3 + 2. I always ask people, what comes to mind, or maybe what comes to your embodied mind when you hear 3 + 2? And if you keep pressing on people, yes, what does it mean? Eventually they get frustrated and they start waving their hands or gesturing, bringing the 2 hands together. And I say, that is what addition means to you qualitatively. It is this binary accumulation. It's like bringing stuff together, or maybe unary accumulation, bringing one stack of stuff onto the other, whether it's continuous stuff or discrete stuff. That is what addition means to you at its deepest, and like the most primitive image you have, bringing stuff together. Okay, that's the meaning. That is the grounding for you of the symbol plus, and I'm using the phrase of symbol grounding from Professor Stephen Harnad. That is the grounding for you, bringing stuff together. That's what addition means. And I think, wouldn't it be marvelous if we had such grounding for all the mathematical concepts that we study? Because soon after addition, multiplication, and once kids hit fractions, not to mention algebra, they lose that sense of grounding. So that they feel, they just resort to crunching those symbols, going through those rote algorithms of you put this here, you put there, n choose k, you do this, do that, you get the answer, hopefully you get an A+, but with little to no meaning. So my work is about occasioning opportunities for students to develop the meaning, the grounded meaning of mathematical concepts by virtue of engaging in the activities that I design, which I'm happy to say more about.
Oh, very useful. You've covered a lot of territory very quickly there, and these might seem very simple questions to listeners, but they're not. And I think you are shining a light on the complexity here of some of these kind of I'm going to call them learning theories, because most people understand what these mean. And before we go on a little bit more to talk a little bit about embodiment and the role of embodiment in learning and so on, particularly mathematics and so on. I mentioned constructivism before. Now, I don't want to get bogged down too heavy here, but I mentioned constructivism because the dominance within education is writ large, and there might be some teachers or educators or listening, and they'll go, well, okay, Great answer, Dor. But what's the difference between an activism and constructivism, for instance?
Okay. So the theoretical way of thinking about it is, where is knowledge located? And some of my colleagues who get annoyed when I'm still cheering for Piaget, they said, yes, but he believes that these schemas are in the head, as though they need to be on the outside as well, or like an inherent relationality. There's no inside and outside. It's just experience that we are reflecting upon. But here's a word for Piaget, all right? In fact, I have a chapter in which I begin by saying, what if Piaget were right? What if it's true that indeed we learn everything through, as young people, as babies, etc., through sensory motor engagement with the world? Because in that case, we had better arrange our learning environments to enable such learning, as did indeed some disciples of Piaget, like Constance Camille and others. So what you're right. If Piaget were right, then the Montessori directions of education are the way we should go. But then at some point in the chapter, I say, well, what if Piaget were wrong? Wrong in the sense of his stage theory, by which he believed that after a certain age, we have experienced sufficiently the sensory motor experience of being in our natural and cultural ecology, to the point that we no longer really think that way. We think in more formal ways. So if from that perspective, well, you hit childhood's end, as Arthur C. Clarke calls it. You get to the point where, well, you no longer need these toys. You no longer need to interact with all of these cute, manipulatives. You need to just think, and you need to write symbols, etc. Well, yeah. So what if Piaget were wrong about that stage theory? What if we are lifelong sensory motor learners? I know for sure I am, and I don't think I'm too unusual. Because if that were true, and if enactivism, the more the stolid principle that all perception is for action, and cognitive structures emerge from recurring patterns of sensory motor activity that enable action to be perceptually guided. If all of this is true, then that means that when you learn a new concept, maybe you hit a certain grade where they're learning about probability, right? And it doesn't help for the teacher to say, well, here are the symbols, and these are the ideas expressed alphanumerically, and here are the rote ways of here are the formulas, and just plug things in. It would be the case that you still need to engage in some sensory motor activity, whereby you explore and find a new perceptual solution that enables you to act in the ways that instantiate that concept. So all this brings us back to design. But I might say that even within Piaget, you find, he wrote so much. He wrote a book a year or something all his life, spanned most of the 20th century. He was born in 1896, I believe, same year as Vygotsky, by the way, and I think passed away in 1981. And right, I think his first article was age something ridiculous, like 11, something shocking, that when you observed some rare bird in the skies of Geneva or something like that, and books galore. So you can find, if you do some archaeological digging, you will excavate some skepticism when he says, even thoughts are kind of like actions. So you see that way of thinking, which could have gone in more radical ways, but right, he did. He made his absolutely marvelous and seminal contributions to cognitive developmental psychology.
Oh, yeah. His contribution in education is humongous.
Exactly.
You mentioned the 4 stages of cognitive development. This stuff is still taught today. And I would say that there are kind of 3 theories that are taught still today. One's the computational model, which is you've already spoken about. Input output. The other one, I call it the computational model. The processing model. which you've already alluded to, which was very popular 60s onwards, thanks to Alan Turing. And you've already spoken about Piaget and then behaviorism through Skinner. Now, where does enactivism sit within those three? Because those three learning theories are still taught today in, kind of teacher education, at least in Australia. I can't speak for America, and maybe you can touch on what's taught in America, I guess. But I'm just wondering where it fits, in those kind of obviously behaviorism and so on. I interrupted you.
No problem. So, I mean, this is, as Thomas Kuhn spoke about, the paradigms are changing. It takes maybe expectedly or paradoxically, it's schools of education sometimes take the longest to change in how they educate. Well, you can imagine that if a professor professed something all their career and then the students do too, they'd be unlikely one day to say, "Oh, excuse me, I was wrong," right? And start. So these things take time. I try to change things in my own department by profoundly changing the courses in cognitive development and moving towards embodiment. But this will maybe in 10 years' time we'll see a radical change as various scholars retire and other. I might say that 20 years ago, I began because you've been our guest on that, I began an international reading group and a lab, and I called the reading group the Embodied Underground. And not for no reason. I actually had a colleague back in 2005 when I began, and she said to me that her advisor told her, hands-off gesture, which is kind of funny. Hands off, keep your hands off gesture. Don't study gesture because you might not get tenure. It was that bad.
Yeah.
So I created the Embodied Underground, and we would meet, read the samizdat, read the papers on embodiment. And I still call the group the Embodied Underground, but we're much less clandestine, right? Clandestine these days.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that narrative, that story, because even myself within a school of education talking about embodiment, it's almost, I still can't believe I'm going to say this, but it's not really understood and therefore accepted. It's considered to be this kind of fringe kind of thinking and theories, and I find that absolutely that's still Godsmack. I'm still amazed by that, that it's not really considered mainstream, and so I can then understand this is your area of expertise, and so I'm wondering what that means for you in terms of acceptance and this ongoing battle and fight in academia to get some acceptance. And
well, to begin with, I actually told my colleague, the person who told me that her advisor said hands-off gesture. I said, but you're studying something completely different. You're publishing about something. Like, she says, yes, but my real passion is gesture. And I said to her, but that's like telling me you love this bloke, but you're sleeping with this other guy for the past 6 years. Like, you marry this. Like, what? How can you do this? So, for me, being an academician, it's not a day job. It's not a 9 to 5. It's who I am. It's sort of burning in my blood, as the prophets would say. And so I cannot choose to study this or that. I need to go with my scientific integrity. I need to go with my intuitions. I need to go with my introspection into what it means to know, to reason, to learn. And I have about 1,000 hours of tutoring one-on-one under my wing. And that is where I learned about what it might mean to know and to learn. So I try to change things by using a Trojan horse of trying to infiltrate the enemy by doing cognitive neuroscience experiments, demonstrating that learning is exactly that which we believe it to be. For example, led by my fabulous student who's now a PhD, Sophia Tancredi, we did what's called recurrent quantification analysis, RQA, where we were looking to, and indeed succeeded, in modeling mathematical insight as a phase transition between two what's called complex dynamic systems attractors. So just like say a horse, so I'm talking now about coordination dynamics. A horse is walking along, and then the horse puts in more effort in their motion. At some point, the walk turns into a trot, and if they keep going, it will become a gallop. Unless they're Icelandic horses, in which they'll have the third gear called trot, or turt, sorry. So just in the same way as a horse transitions from one phase to the next phase, so we were able to show that mathematical insight is characterized by a shift from one way of moving the hands and looking around as you're solving a problem to a whole other kind of way of perceiving the situation to act upon it. So we've been able to isolate what it is that changes as people engage in a mathematical problem and find a solution. So we characterize it according to the motions of the hand, the motion of the eyes, because we're tracking the children's sight, and triangulating that with what the children are telling us as they engage in problem solving. So we don't need symbols in the head. We don't need information processing. It's all about changing the way you perceive the environment in order to act upon it. And the change in perception is where new objects are born, new ontologies, if you will, that we can think about, talk about. We can even copy them to paper. We can measure them. We can do various calculations on their properties. But it all begins by changing our perception of the environment, creating new gestalts, new ways that are perceiving, that are grounded in now neurally in our brain. They're grounded as new cognitive structures that enable us to act that way. So learning in mathematics is precisely that. And so this is our way of moving forward by using the enemy's tricks, their methodologies, and demonstrating that what we believe to be true is backed by strong data, evidence for our claims. And in fact, no matter how much we scan brains, we never see information, we never see symbols, we never see symbol crunching. It's not about that. And so with time, I believe the onus will shift to those cognitivists who will have to bring forth data which they can never present because it's just not there. Data of what they believe to be human thinking.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is a good time now to move towards a little bit around embodiment. And you mentioned before the 3+2, you reduce to, like fingers. I have 3 fingers and then I have 2 fingers and I kind of put them together. And it's interesting that you gave that example. Is that a fair example to say the embodied component here, particularly with mathematical concepts and so on and so forth? Is that a simplistic way of viewing what you mean by how embodiment can work in mathematical learning?
Well, again, as an orthodox activist, I would say that all thinking is necessarily a sensory motor activity. So that's axiomatic for me. And so learning about addition, I had a very talented graduate student, Zoe Silverman, was watching videos of it's from an art installation in Japan, in which children were walking around on a huge mound of clay, and these are they're hardly toddlers. Well, I guess they're walking around, toddlers, walking on a mound of clay and picking up clay and doing this and doing that. And we looked very closely in the video at several children who picked clay in one hand and then moved it to the other hand, and then went probably from the dominant to the recessive hand, and then went on looking, found some more clay, and didn't know what to do with it, so they glued it back onto the clay they already had in their left hand, and then found some more clay and picked up in the right hand and glued it on the left. And Zoe and I were looking at these data and thinking, wow, this is the dawn of addition. this is the dawn of accumulation. This is now children developing the cognitive structures that will henceforth enable them to ground the notion of addition. Because if you've never like put stuff together, and I say to you, and we talk about addition, like 3 plus 2, like what is the meaning of that, right? Stuck together or maybe moved. Yeah, I mean, there are many ways of
complicated. Like just the simple operation of 3 plus 2. Everyone thinks that's very simple and basic, but it's extremely complicated what sits behind that. And by extension, any operation, subtraction, multiplication, division, like you said before, they're the main operations we're familiar with, but they are extremely complicated. So am I right in thinking that without a strong foundation from a young age, forget about it when you become an adolescent or beyond that? Or are you saying a little bit more than that? It's not over Red Rover, if I haven't had those foundations from a young kid, are you saying that give up on mathematical learning in adolescence, or you're not saying that at all?
I would not say that. I mean, cognitive developmental psychologists do speak about something called maturation. For example, critical ages for acquiring a language as your native language. So folks who are, who migrate at later ages, they can sort of form a nice command, unless they're Vladimir Nabokov or someone. So they form a manageable command of the language, but it's never really native. So there's that kind of aspect of the mental maturation. However, I would take this back to the early ages and speak about accumulating research that's finding these intriguing correlations between children's fine motor dexterity and their mathematical aptitude, between their spatial, from the word space, for spatial reasoning and their mathematical reasoning. And so many people are, right, when 1,000,001 apps, of course, are wondering, can we increase the fine motor skills of young children so that they will become better in mathematics? And there's some evidence that intervention can actually do that. So becoming, if you improve your prestidigitation, then your digitation, indeed, it's interesting, right? The word digit means finger, that's where it comes from. We count with our digits. So prestidigitation improves mathematical reasoning. It's so there are these correlations. I'm sure some people say, yeah, it's not conclusive and so on, but there's increasing accumulating accounts of these correlations. And as far as we're concerned, one can indeed remedy mathematical thinking by engaging the kinds of activities that my lab and my international collaborators create. So don't give up out there, guys.
Well, no, I mean, it makes sense because you think about it from a very young age, your hands represent a number line, don't they? And you can see young children. I got young children, and you can see them initially when they're coming to understand numbers and use the operation, use the example we've had before about 3 plus 2. You can see them, count on their fingers, 1, 2, 3, and then I add another 2, and then I add them there, I count them. Yeah. So you can see how that just represents a number line. However, there's this there's that embodied component. This is why I like that example you used before. And I think this is a nice segue into embodiment, embodied cognition and mathematics and so on and so forth. So what does that mean to you?
Well, just maybe a quick comment about the fingers.
Yeah.
And that is that, well, indeed, we may want to be in a situation where we want to count something, but I'll already say that is, the child is, again, that loaded phrase is participating in the social enactment of a cultural practice. The very notion of wanting to count to determine the cardinal feature of the cardinal quality of a discrete set of objects. That in and of itself is something that probably you wouldn't do back in the jungle or wherever we came from. It is already enframed by certain circumstances, certain task demands, certain socio-epistemic pressure to do just those kinds of things. And once again, I wouldn't I understand completely when you say the fingers are a number line or maybe an abacus or what have you.
Yeah.
That I would rather say that the fingers, they occasion themselves, they afford a certain kind of activity. They empower or enhance or amplify our capacity to determine the cardinal property of a set. And we might want to do that if, just imagine, this is work by famous French mathematics education researcher called Guy Brousson, where he wanted very young children to learn cardinality, learn counting, and learn the very notion of one-to-one correspondence. You know, that's and the idea of tallying with your fingers or what have you, tallying a certain discrete one. So he put on two sides of a room, he put objects that needed somehow to match each other. For example, I don't quite remember, it might have been empty cups on one side and maybe sticks on the other, and each cup needed to get one stick. So the kids they looked at the cups and they went to the other side and they didn't know how many sticks they needed. So they went back to the cups and looked and they went again. Eventually the kids started determining on their own, reinventing, as we call it, guided reinventing, started reinventing on their own this idea of somehow metaphorically carrying with them the sense of how many cups are back there, like using their fingers at times. Okay, this finger is this cup, this finger is that cup, this finger, so as to exhaust the whole count, and then keeping their fingers flayed this way, they would go to the other side of the room and then take as many objects as there are fingers. So is it counting? Well, it's getting there. It's creating one-to-one correspondence, even if you don't have names for them. All this to say is that fingers are wonderful, and it's due to having 10 fingers that we popularly...
Well, it has utility. I take my fingers wherever I go, right?
It's very good for you, and you don't forget them. And that's why we count in base 10, of course, because that's our fingers. But please refresh my memory what your question was.
Oh, yeah, let's go to the question of embodiment, embodied cognition and mathematics. And if you like, you can talk a little bit about your lab. That's the lab that you were talking before about, the Embodied Design Research Lab, which I've been fortunate enough to sit in one of your sessions. And I got to say thank you for letting me sit in one of your sessions at Berkeley. But I'll let you answer this question however you like.
Right. So our lab, the Embodied Design Research Laboratory, EDRL.berkeley.edu, if you want to follow us, as they say. So we are indeed a design-based research lab. We are educational researchers. More specifically, we are learning scientists. So my PhD is in the learning sciences. And we do design-based research, which, as I said earlier, it's a general approach to educational research, where the studies that we do live within these cycles of finding some design problem and then trying to find solutions, and on the way picking up interesting research questions that then hone our investigations. And so the work produces three kinds of, it yields three kinds of fruits. One is contributions to theory, theoretical models in the cognitive sciences, the learning sciences. The other one is the artifacts themselves. We usually get to the point of building prototypes that then are picked up by industry, so that our work is used daily by millions of people around the world. But then the third aspect is that we create a design framework, meaning that our colleagues out there, we try to articulate what it is that we do when we create these objects. So because we operate from, as our name, embodiment, or we operate from these perspectives, or enactivism, etc., we will look to create educational resources where the principle is, take a concept that you want somebody to learn, now make it into a phenomenon, phenomenalize it in the form of something that people need to do. Okay, so it's not about knowing yet, it's try to do something. For example, we have one kind of paradigm we call the mathematics imagery trainer. And in this case, we started asking initially, the first concept we worked on was proportion, ever since it's been used for many other concepts. But imagine that both your hands are on your desk in front of you, and you are sitting opposite a screen that has also a camera, and so it can pick up where your hands are. And the screen is red. And we say, okay, move your hands somehow to make the screen green. So people initially try to lift one hand up and down, and it's still red. They lay that hand down, then they try the other hand up and down, the screen is still red. So they try both hands up and down, it's red. They try to move the hands more rapidly, but it's still red. At which point they break up into this, as I said earlier, the sensory motor exploration, and just randomly, which is a great way of starting, just flail their hands, and at some moment the screen is green. So they freeze their hands. Now, what is happening here? The camera is picking up the location of the hands, and a simple procedure determines the height of the hand above the desk. And so imagine one hand is, maybe your left hand is now 10 centimeters over your desk, and your right hand is double that, 20 centimeters over the desk. So this 10 per 20, that is, the heights are at a ratio of 1:2. Now, unbeknownst to you, this particular activity, this wacky activity that you find yourself doing in our lab or in your classroom or wherever, this is designed explicitly for you as a child to learn about ratio and proportion, because you've never studied that. And here's where it gets cool, because the kid had been flailing their hands and the screen suddenly went green because your hands are at the respective heights of 1:2 or 10 centimeters per 20. And the kid stops and freezes there and kind of has this look on their face of, now what? And we say, well, okay, great. Now move your hands, both of them, keeping the screen green. Now, if you're a child who is sitting there and all, you've never studied the idea of proportion, it will probably not occur to you to move your hand proportionally. And there's no reason why you should do that. All you've done is found one place where it's green. So you look around, there's no what we call frame of reference. There's no lines or just nothing. It's just you and the screen. So you look at your hands and say, well, there must be some kind of method in this madness. And all of this is happening in just one or 2 seconds. And so the kids say, all right, so the only thing I could perceive here is the interval, the space between my hands. Okay, so let's move my hands up, keeping that space. So they keep, I hope the listeners can imagine this. Your hands are now sort of affixed with the same, 10 centimeters between them, and you raise both of them simultaneously, keeping that distance between the hands as though there's some object that you're holding between your hands. Well, of course, the screen goes red. And why does it go red? Because you don't yet know what you found yourself in. And now you have violated that ratio, because now you're maybe at 30 and 40 or 40 and 50 centimeters above the desk, which is no longer a 1:2 ratio. So the children will go, oh, I messed up. And they still believe that the distance should be the same, but they somehow think that they didn't execute that well. They think that somehow as they raised their hands, the distance between their hands changed. And so they correct the distance until it's green again. Then once again, they raise their hand, it goes red, and they correct it back to green. So what you see here is a child exploring an environment. They have a certain theory as to how it works. They're implementing that theory, and repeatedly seeing that the results contradict the theory, but for a long time still holding on, well, maybe that theory is right, which is what we children tend to do. I think adults, unfortunately, for our finances, we tend to do that as well. But so at some point, the child goes, wait a minute, I realize as I raise my hand, I keep correcting the same way. As the hands go up, I keep on having to correct it by making it bigger, making it larger, making the distance, the spatial interval greater. So how about I sort of preempt that or prefix that by making the distance greater even before I get to the point where I want it to be. And then they figure out how to do just that, so that eventually they're moving and keeping constantly green. And they look up to you and say, oh, the higher the hands go, the bigger the distance. So what you're seeing here is classical Piagetian sensory motor learning, only that this child may be 10 or 11 or 12 years old, or whatever age. They are now, as Piaget would say, they are assimilating the constraints of this environment they found themselves in by virtue of accommodating the way they move to the point where they create, Piaget would say, a new schema, right? There's a new sensory motor pattern that now, per enactivism, now that you have this new cognitive structure that is enabling your actions to be perceptually guided. Because you go, oh, the higher I go, the bigger the distance. Now, what is wondrous about this, and often as we know in science, it's the simplest things that suddenly, the kind of the duh things that we look at a new way and we go, wow, that's not duh, that's wow. What a subtle yet critical thing that happens along the way is the children are attending to the distance between their hands. Now, I want to remark here that there's nothing between the hand, nothing physical, just like magicians might say, there's nothing here, right? To the audience at home, there's nothing here between. And yet we are attending, from the word attention, we are attending to that interval as though it is a thing, an ontology, a thing we can look at, a thing that has properties. It has length, and it has locations. It can be a high or low elevation. And we can even talk about correlating the elevation with the length. The higher I go, the bigger the distance. And so we have attended to something that is not there. And our lab, inspired by our colleagues, Dan Hutto and Raul Sanchez Garcias, we talk about that interval between the hands as being an attentional anchor. So to speak, it is anchoring our attention. It is a new way of looking. Just like when we do in sports, we figure out new ways of perceiving. Maybe when you're juggling, you imagine a tall rectangle in front of you. Maybe when you're playing table tennis, ping pong, you imagine a triangle of the ball coming and hitting and going back. We are projecting, if you will, or perceiving or seeing in our mind's eye. We are seeing this element which is not there. We're taking it to be real. We're talking about it, and we say the higher the hands go, the bigger it is. And this idea of the attentional anchor, it's been substantiated. I mentioned earlier that we do this recurrent quantification analysis kind of work where we're tracking where the child's eyes are going. And we see that the more often they look between their hands, the closer they get to the solution. We have some striking experiments where the child begins seeing things we're not even aware of and talking about them, and it's only months later that we figure out what they were talking about, because they come to see the world in a new way that enables them to their perception to guide their action. And it's, of course, people listening will say, well, where's the math in all this? So
yes, you've answered my next question.
well, there we go. I guess I've spoken about this for a while by now. I can anticipate what people are wondering. So our principle is experience first and signify later. So you are first developing this cognitive structure, enabling your actions to be perceptually guided. You develop through the sensory motor exploration. And it is only then that we shift into, if you will, this mathematical semiotic register, using mathematical words and symbols and diagrams and various symbolic artifacts in order to describe what it is we're doing. And we bring this in a subtle way. We will increase the task demand of what the children are trying to do, and then we will put into the environment, interpolate onto the screens, or depending on what media we are using, we'll interpolate various mathematical artifacts. Like in this case, I was speaking about moving the hands. We will bring onto the screen a grid, vertical and horizontal lines, and just watch to see what happens. We might say to the child, oh, I'm bringing this on the screen. You might want to use it or not. It doesn't matter. And then we look to see, and what we're seeing repeatedly in many experiments and with in many contexts and locations, different labs and different age groups and different media, when the children see these, in this case, these lines, they recognize in these lines, I'll call them latent utilities, like opportunities, or in ecological psychology, we call it affordances. They note that these lines can help them do what they have been doing. These lines, as they're moving their hands up and down, suddenly rather than having a blank screen, suddenly there are these parking spaces. There are places where you can bring your hand and keep your hand there. Suddenly there's a there. Until now it's been a blank screen. Suddenly there's a there. There's a place to put your hand, and you know where your hand is. And so they park one hand, and then the other hand goes up and it makes it green. Then they lift, and before we know it, the simultaneous motion of hands becomes sequential. Left hand goes up this, right hand goes up that. And the child says to us, oh, for every one I go up on the left, I go up two on the right. And then we see how the children shift into like a mathematical discourse. They are talking now about what they have been doing. They have now language. So much so that one of the grandfather of enactivism, Umberto Maturana, he had a funny word for this. He would say that the children are, he took the noun language and made a verb out of it. The kids are languaging. They are languaging. And this is this epistemic mental capacity we have. We can not only do, we can reflect on our doing. And in reflecting, using this inner speech or talking to people, using gesture, using words, using symbols, using demonstrative actions, we can now think about and talk about and articulate what it is we are doing. But as I said earlier, experience first, signify later. So first, if we go back to Michelangelo, it's first Adam just using what Adam knows to do, but within this funky environment with a computer, just learning how to move his hands in a new way. In fact, that's our lab's motto: learning is moving in new ways. Adam is very good at that. But then that dude on the right, the teacher or what have you, the cultural forms say, well, thanks, Adam, but that's not good enough. If you want to grow up and succeed in this world as we know it, you better figure out this mathy way of talking about documenting, programming, predicting, sharing. You need to work out this way of talking. And invariably, when we pick up a mathy way of looking at the world, it will demand of us to notice in what we have been doing and seeing and feeling, to notice properties that have been kind of invisible to us. They've been latent, but we haven't noticed them. So in this case, as the hands go up and down, we're starting to think of it discretely as locations and distances, and distance from the desk. If you remember, it's all about distance from the desk. And these symbolic forms, like a grid, they suggest, they have that affordance or that suggestion of counting from the ground up. And so we see the children shift. They're hooked in by those grids, but then they shift into this different way of thinking and talking. And before we know it, they're showing us on paper and drawing lines and measuring and figuring out what we call ratio and proportion. So that's the shift from the doing to the describing, the languaging. And we've set all of this up so that it will go in that direction.
Yeah. I'll make sure that we put in details in the episode descriptor about the Embodied Design Research Lab at the University of California, Berkeley, where you're located. And I'll put some other information up there about some of your publications. For instance, what you just described there is a chapter in one of my books. You might remember the chapter. It was based on some of the work you've done, towards an activist mathematics pedagogy. I'll make sure all that's up in the episode descriptor. Now, I have kind of three kind of broadish type questions. Don't hold me to the three. We might have more or less, but I've got about three kind of questions here because we're running out of time. You've been very generous with your time. But I want to ask you a question around a very practical type question. Now, there might be some teachers or educators who are listening to this podcast right now, and if they have to teach mathematics, say at primary school level, like, elementary or secondary school, like high school, what advice would you give them? Like, what's some advice you would give them to a teacher or an educator who has to teach mathematics?
Yes. So here's the advice I would not give. So let's start with that. I have some colleagues who say, oh, when teachers gesture, the children learn more. So, hey, teachers, go ahead and gesture. And that's like saying, well, never mind the analogies, but I don't see that as it seems like a very superficial way of going about fixing education, because we all gesture as we talk anyway. But the question is, what are we talking about? So I would invite teachers and say to them, I'm sure you're all math teachers, no matter what level you teach, you're very comfortable with the basic notion of the arithmetic operation of addition, right? The 3 + 2 is the 3 fingers here and the 2 fingers there coming together, and we recount it as 5. You're very comfortable with that idea of addition as the bringing together, stacking, or extending along some linear trajectory, or what have you, whatever it is, the way that you think of addition. But how about multiplication? How do you think about it? So, and fractions, etc. So what I'm inviting teachers to do is to access their innermost sensation or sense or sensory motor experience that is evoked by whatever it is, the concept that they are teaching. Because that is where the sense is. And that is what students themselves need to develop. And if the teachers, they introspect and they look everywhere and they find no sense, for, I don't know, for a variable or an asymptote or a tangent or what have you, it's just something that for them is on paper, then I would encourage them to try and develop those kinds of understandings and maybe speak to their colleagues and maybe read some of our papers or what have you, because that is where students will draw from. It is when teachers are speaking knowingly, but in an embodied knowingly way, when they speak in an embodied knowing way about their understanding of a concept, that is what the children will pick up. Because what the teachers are doing when they speak that way, gesturing and speaking about mathematical objects, what they're doing is they're changing their own students' perception. They're creating opportunities for the students to develop those cultural ways of orienting to the world, of evoking these imaginary objects that we're talking about and transforming them. So that would be my prime invitation. And one can, to get a sense of what these things are, one can also engage with some of the activities that my colleagues and I have created, which gives you a sense of what we're talking about.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, we're on the home stretch. 2 kind of broad questions. So my next question is, what 3 books or resources would you recommend or to anyone who's listening here? They could be your publications or it could be just anything in general. What 3 books or resources would you recommend? It doesn't have to be exactly 3, but I'm just using 3 as an example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So one came out recently by MIT Press, and it calls Action Matters. And it is a collection of chapters about the function of embodiment in learning, which I hope people find engaging. There's a nice book by my colleague Mitch Nathan, which is really it's a companion at the graduate level for embodiment. So there's that. And look at the work of our lab. Look at in particular the work that is aimed at teachers. My lab as well, EDRL, as well as collaborators like my dear friend and collaborator Anna Schwartz. Schwartz, she's at Utrecht. That's Utrecht, Utrecht University in the Netherlands. So those would be my.
I think that book by Mitch Nathan is Embodied Learning. Have I got that right?
That sounds right.
Yeah. I was hoping to interview him for the podcast at some point, but and visit him when I was at University of Wisconsin-Madison. But funding fell over. But you know how it is in higher ed. Funding can be difficult to access sometimes. No, thanks for that. Now, and my kind of last question, really, before we kind of finish up, is tell us a little bit about, any upcoming projects or research projects or anything that you think that is relevant or you would like to just share with anyone who's listening now?
Yeah. So I spoke about the neuroscientific Trojan horse, and hopefully by the time this airs, we will have already got the grant to do the kind of work we want to do. So I have multiple international collaborations. Usually we have more than a dozen projects going on at the same time, and one of them is based in Poland, in Warsaw, at the Copernicus Science Center, where a couple of years ago they inaugurated a new wing where we can do research while children interact with exhibits. So the Copernicus Center is, for those who know, in San Francisco, the Exploratorium, or various math museums and things like that in New York and Brooklyn, etc. These interactive exhibits that children come in and work. Well, that center hosts 1 million people a year.
Wow.
And a few years, I've been working with them for a decade, and a few years ago they commissioned from me, the backstory was Ukraine refugee children moving into Poland, not having a shared language with their classmates or with the teacher, and we were trying to imagine what it might be for two people to learn mathematics, basic mathematics, to experience mathematics with little to no language. So that's kind of the backstory of what became a device that I designed and was built and developed at the center, which is called ortho, which is kind of the beginning of the word orthogonal. So ortho is, I like to pitch it, people find this curious, as a cross between Etch-a-Sketch and mini golf. In the sense, in the sense that there's an object that needs to move. There's a very large table. It's called a digital tabletop. It's just think of like your dining room table, but it's the top, rather than being wood or what have you. It's a screen. So it's a giant tablet.
Yeah, like a big iPad
table. Yeah, a giant iPad, digital tabletop. And when you arrive at this and you see there's a sort of let's call it a maze or a labyrinth. So what you'd see in mini golf, the ball starts here and has to get there. Along the way, there might be different branches and ways you can go, or squiggly ways and things. So it's like a maze. The ball starts here. Now the point is, it's all digital. So the ball is like a white circle. The thing is, you cannot put your hand directly on the ball and move it. Rather, it's a game for two players. So imagine there's a rectangle. And to use the math language, which we don't initially do, but just for this description, say, Stephen, that you are on the X side of the table and I'm on the Y side of the table. And the table is the top right quadrant, how we think of graphs. It's just the XY system, but just that top right-hand quadrant. And the thing is, you, Stephen, you can move the ball only sideways, back and forth. I can move the ball only vertically, up and down. But the thing is that the maze is all squiggly. So what are we going to do? So this is why I said it's a bit like Etch-a-Sketch. You and I need to figure out how to move together in order to move this ball through the labyrinth. And along the way, as we also step through the levels, it becomes, as you remember, experience first, signify later. It becomes, we interpolate the mathematical symbolic artifacts inside. So by the time kids are finished playing, 5 minutes later or what have you, they're already referring to locations on the space using the ordered values, such as it's at 7-4.
Yes.
Oh, you need to go to 5-9 or so they are learning through that. But what we're interested is how the children are collaborating, how they figure out to work together, what it is that changes in how they perceive their environment. So we've been gathering what's called action logs. Every time as the song from the Police goes, every move you make, every move they make, it's I'll be watching you, is recorded into the computer memory. And so by now we are nearing 500,000 plays.
Wow.
Which we are churning through using artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all kind of data processing algorithms to figure out the latent patterns inside of what it is people are doing in order to learn how to move together. And the Pie in the Sky project is to extract, by looking at pairs where there's a parent and a child, to extract what it is that parents are doing to help children learn the system. And if we can extract that, then we could embed that back into software where there's just one player and the other player is an artificially intelligent sort of a parent-like partner to play, so that not just 1 million people a year will play this, but billions of people around the world. Basically, any child who has access to PDA to a phone or tablet or can download the app.
Sorry to interrupt you there. I guess this is a perfect opportunity for me to ask a bit of a follow-up question to what you were talking about there before with that design, research design there. And I guess it's a fundamental question for me because as I've heard you talk during our interview, I probably should have asked you earlier, but I feel like this is a more of an appropriate time to ask. And my question, it's a big question, is mathematical concepts, is mathematics, is it innate or is it something we discover?
Well, again, back to staunch activism, the world doesn't exist out there. Or it's what we make of it, is what we perceive, is what we figure out through interaction. We find these relationalities, what Gibson calls affordances. And so if if the early Wittgenstein said, what's the first line of the Tractatus? The world is the sum total of the facts or the things that are, right? So, but the later Wittgenstein will say the world is the sum total of the things we do and the things we do together and the cultural practices we engage in. So moving away from an analytic to a continental perspective on ontology and the world out there. So I would say that there are phenomena that if we inquire into them, we can discover regularities that are determined by their chemical, physical, biological structures. But it's not that mathematics as a discipline, of course, does not pre-exist us. A discipline is it's this edifice of cultural practice. It's civilizations that formulate mathematics as this intact discipline, as a way of thinking about doing. Going back to Pythagoras and others, and the Mayans and etc. all over the world, when those cultures who deemed it interesting or useful to think about doing in ways that kind of move away, or in Latin, abstract, move away from the original situations. So so that's mathematics as a discipline does not pre-exist us, but it is something that we can become enculturated into as forms of thinking about doing. Maybe I'll just throw in here, when we speak to the leading mathematicians in the world, just so people listening to me don't think, oh, he's that wacky Berkeley professor. You listen to a person like actually an Australian, an import from Australia, Professor Terence Tao, who originally Australian and was, I guess, discovered, might be the right word, by Paul Erdős. Terence Tao, at the age of 24, he became a full professor at UCLA, which I find as a personal affront. 24, really?
Wow, that's amazing.
He's very generous in sharing his thinking online, and people ask him, well, how do you think? He says, it's these images and these metaphors and these pictures, and maybe I think of eggs frying on oil, or maybe it's a jet ski on waves. He said there was one point where I was thinking through partial differential equation, the really tough thing about wave transformation. I lay down on the floor in my office and rolled over to try and make sense of that concept. Then he goes on, well, of course, I didn't say that in my book. And I'm like, why didn't you say that in your book? But the leading mathematicians and scientists, when you interview them, you listen to their testimonies, going back to people like Henri Poincaré, Albert Einstein, others, they think in images. We think that way. Of course, it's very useful to write things down and to organize our thoughts, but the thinking itself is embodied and inactive.
That's interesting. No, thanks for that. I should have probably asked you that question earlier, but when I heard you talking about, the iPad, the example of the iPad it's not a museum. What do they call it again? An experiential museum?
Well, that particular place is called the Copernicus
That's right.
Science Center.
Science Center, yeah. And that's very experiential, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's all interactive.
Yeah. And I can, which seems to be the domain of science, isn't it? But it's not just the domain of science, of course. But, whenever you go to these kind of science centers, it's heavily interactive. Everything's interactive. There's a lot of hands-on. There's all of those kind of things. And, of course, it's not ideal to talk about that science. This is mathematics over here. They're kind of somehow separated. They're integrated, particularly in ways that we've been talking about. Now, let's go to my kind of last kind of broad kind of question. And it's not really a question, but it's more a question to you to think, is there anything you think we've missed that you would like to add before we finish up? You'd like to maybe talk about or say, or do you think I've missed asking you a question or something that you would like to maybe cover?
I might just say how important the work that my colleagues and I, how important this work is in making mathematics accessible to everyone. There's so many people, and I'm quoting some of my mentors who kind of worry about how some people are very will say, "Oh yeah, math. I hate math. Or I'm not good at math." But nobody will say, "Oh, I'm not good at speaking. I'm not good at writing." They wouldn't be all jolly about that, right? There's something about the way that math is taught throughout the area, from what we call K-12, from kindergarten to 12th grade and beyond, that makes it prohibitive for so many people, and we're trying to fix that by making it accessible, making it fun. And by the way, about accessible, that's a whole other branch of what we do in the lab. We're making our mathematical educational resources accessible to people with sensory differences, motor differences, cognitive differences, and cultural and linguistic diversity. But we want to make mathematics a fun, engaging activity that makes sense. And it will make sense when you make sense of it. And so we're making mathematics into sensory motor activity. So, and if more education were this way, I think we'd have many more people enjoying, engaging in, and excelling in mathematics. So I see this as a global campaign that we should all be invested in.
Yeah. I thank you for saying that, because mathematics, as someone who taught mathematics at a senior secondary school, senior level, I know how challenging it can be to teach well. And I know that as a educational system, at least I'll speak from an Australian point of view, is that it's notoriously, first of all, difficult to teach at a secondary school level. But then it varies considerably, from state and territory and jurisdiction, and I mean, there are a whole range of complicated reasons why. And so I share your enthusiasm, if you like, and advocacy about how important it is to get this right, because I don't know what it is that happens, when students or young people, when they're about 13, 14 years old, I don't know, something happens where...
It's called puberty.
Yeah, exactly. Well, funny you say that, because I have a daughter who's at that age. And, yes.
Bless her.
And so I don't know. I don't want to explain it away to say that it's just puberty and that it is, but I don't know what it like. No. There's some kind of there's this kind of, I think it's cultural, personally, like a phobia of sorts. Now, thankfully, she's naturally gifted academically, so it's not a problem. She can do this without even a second thought. However, I know from talking to her that some of her friends, they absolutely turn off. It's like, oh, I can't do it, so I'm not even going to bother. And it's kind of, I don't know, it really concerns me.
I'll tell you an interesting story for that. Maybe with that we'll end. So the interesting story is from my colleague Susan Jarofsky, who's up in Vancouver, and she reported about 15 years ago a striking experiment that she did. She went into some classroom in just an average school somewhere, where the students were, I think, learning about graphs or something like that, and she asked the teacher, Can I just pull out one student after the other for just 5 minutes just to ask a question? The teacher said, sure, let's do that. So she pulls out these kids one by one, and she basically, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, right? But you can look up her words, Susan Jarofsky. And she showed them a picture of a graph. So there's like this line, a squiggly line, and going through the Cartesian, through the quadrant, right? And she says, well, just tell me what's here. I don't remember the precise question. Now, many of the students just pointed to the line and sort of traced their finger along the line, up and then down or what have you, and said, well, it's just, there it is. And, I see it's right there. So a few of the students, though, engage in a curious activity. They acted as though they were a dot on the line on a roller coaster, and they gestured as though they're going up, and way going down on that other side, as though they could see the graph line in front of themselves, what we call an egocentric perspective. And so Susan said, she made a column and said, okay, here are all the kids who she called that they're just seeing, they're seeing the graph. Yeah, that was Molly and George and so and so. And here's a column of several, just many fewer kids who were, she called it being. They were being the graph. And then after that, she met with the teacher in the hall and said, these are the names. And some kid did this, some kid did that. The teacher looked and said, well, that's really interesting, because the children who were being the graph, these are my top students.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah.
I mean, to jump to like fast forward in the story, there are some students, I guess, like your daughter, who are able, not thanks to education, but I'm sorry to say, despite education, very often, they are able to assume this first person or like egocentric. They are able to be the object they are studying. And we know from science, from many testimonies and books written about it, that top scientists will like Barbara McClintock and others, will become the object that they are studying. Right? So some students are able, despite the teacher not being in touch with his or her own sort of inner mathematical sensory motor structures, some children will figure out how to be the math. And so what I'm looking to do is enabling all children to be the math they're studying.
So thank you. That's excellent. That's an excellent way to finish, I think, because I really like that a lot. That's actually worth following up on and looking into a little bit more. But yeah, I feel like somehow school does a bit of a disservice. I mean, myself and my daughter, we probably didn't need to go to school, but yet, of course, you have to. But that's a conversation for another time.
Gladly.
We might leave it there. What I do is I want to say, first of all, Dor Abrahamson, thank you for your time. You're very generous with your time. We've got a little bit over time, but that's okay, because I think everything you had to say was fascinating. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface, and we could kind of talk for another hour or two, really. I've got so many more questions, but we've got limited time today. Dor's got limited time today. So I just want to say thank you for your time today, and I appreciate
Thank you, Stephen, for hosting me.